little background. I presented something similar to this last month at a conference in D.C., which is called the Ignatian Family Teach-in for Justice. And it was sort of a gathering of mostly Jesuit institutions, colleges, grad schools, seminaries, and sort of social activists to talk about kind of this intersection of spirituality and social justice. So it's kind of an adaptation of that. I've sort of packed a lot in here, so I don't know if I'll have to sort of tear through it or what, but my apologies if there's not a ton of time at the end for questions and whatnot, but also just another preface, if any of this stuff like doesn't connect or doesn't make sense, that's totally fine. Like I hope some of it does. And I was talking to Allie Lutz, who hopefully is on the phone, about this, and I was saying, I feel a little strange kind of using very overtly religious kind of language and sort of discussion in this. And she made a very good point that we should be sort of willing to do this, to kind of share our traditions and do that even if it isn't a completely sort of universalized perspective. So I just want to say that this is going to sound maybe have certain leanings, but it also kind of incorporates more than spiritual traditions with which I personally identify. So if you're not into any of that stuff, you're an extreme atheist, then that's okay. But if you're not comfortable, I don't mean for it to be too unsettling, but maybe it should be in some way. All right, so this is titled my talk, a bunch of buzzwords that we often throw around, and I'm going to hopefully kind of unpack some of it and give a little bit of, maybe even just break what I had as definitions of these terms and leave them a little more open-ended. So, all right, so we'll just start. So this is where I wanted to start. This is a quote from In the Company of the Poor, which is a book that just came out between Gustavo Gutierrez and Paul Farmer. And this is a quote from Gustavo. He says, "The first question of theology is, how do we say to the poor, God loves you?" And I think this question for me, it sort of embodied many years in college and before college where I had this extreme reluctance of associating with any religion, any tradition that tried to somehow explain someone else's suffering and say that it was okay, or say that even though your life sucks, there's something that makes sense out of that there's a reason or a plan for everything, and you just rest assured everything will work out or somehow is worth it. And I never liked that, and I still don't necessarily ascribe to that. But this kept me at a very far distance, I think, from really kind of connecting with my own spiritual identity, was this inability to explain the suffering that I saw in the world, at least in any rational way. So this, my silence in response to this question is sort of where I'm starting from. So this is another quote which doesn't represent necessarily my thinking at that time or even now, but is sort of in the same vein. The cry of one suffering child is enough to prove the non-existence of God. And I think that's something for all of us we could wrestle with, and there aren't any easy answers to that. And how do you imagine an omnipotent, benevolent God allowing senseless suffering? For instance, a dying child. How do we make sense of that? And so this, once again, was like an extreme hurdle that I haven't gotten over, but was one that was really a stumbling block for making any progress in terms of spiritual identity. So, early on in college, I read Mountains Beyond Mountains. I started reading Paul Farmer, and this was another thing that, even though I had this interest in my sort of Catholic faith and sort of that being my background and what I was raised with, I didn't really see the utility of it. I thought that it was sort of irrelevant, and I think that quote right there from Paul Farmer, he says, "To those in great need, solidarity without the pragmatic component can seem like so much abstract piety." And this is Paul, who's, this is from chapter 5 of Pathologies of Power. He's talking about liberation theology and Gustavo Gutierrez, and he's not knocking religion or the church or spirituality, but he is saying, and I sort of took that to an extreme, was saying, yeah, what is this abstract piety? What is this religious, spiritual, abstract stuff? We need to do something material about the problems in the world. And that's sort of what drew me into liberation theology, because the attraction of it was that it was shifting the focus from spiritual needs of people, the church for centuries just saying, endure your lot and you'll be rewarded in the afterlife, and actually say, no, we need to tend to people's material needs and bodies right here. And that not only is that negligent, it's actually sinful to not do that. And I sort of took that, and that was my religious identity. And I didn't have any sense of even what that piety or these other sort of fluffy notions meant, if they had any real value. And then just the next quote on there, I was quoting a teacher from Brazil, which is also Paul quotes. It says, "True generosity consists precisely in fighting to destroy the causes which nourish false charity." Okay, and this was another thing that was like hammering home for me. I was like, yeah, I see so much of this like kind of religious, activity of like, help the poor and feed them and whatever. That's just these gestures, right? It's just like these sort of not very. They weren't actually doing anything to address the problem. They were just sort of alleviating, putting a Band-Aid on the problem, and it was something that I disdained, and once again, which put sort of this extreme distance between finding really any value in perhaps those gestures that did go beyond structural interventions. So this is one last quote before sort of the next chapter of this, which Archbishop Oscar Romero says, "An authentic Christian conversion must lead to an unmasking of the social mechanisms that turn the worker and the peasant into marginalized persons." So once again, they were a little sheepish at the time when in sort of the era of liberation theology in the 60s and 70s, this was thinly veiled Marxism, and it still is. And priests and clergy and people in the church were being persecuted as that. They were being murdered by vigilantes who, in this case, Oscar Romero, who was right-wing sort of paramilitaries of the Salvadoran government that assassinated him for advocating for the poor. And so this is what everything I'm kind of showing here. These sort of with Gustavo and Paul and Freire and Romero. This was sort of my ideology. And it was about action. It was about sort of militant action to actually make tangible change in the world, and that was really all I knew. So this was sort of what came of that. This was my outlook: was a two-front battle against life. Okay, and this is like a huge theme that I'll kind of run through. This is life was not something you could trust. Life was something that seemed arbitrary and senseless, and horrible things happened to people for seemingly no reason. And so I had to fight against life, and my job was to eradicate suffering, both from the world and from my own life. Okay, so suffering was the enemy, and I needed to get rid of it. Okay, so the first front, I guess I kind of wrote this thing down. I'll just sort of read it. I said, early on in college, I became consumed with the shouldn't happen. Determined to eradicate the world's inconceivables, I would channel my perplexity and indignation at others' suffering. To fight the battle against life on two fronts. The first involved saving the innocent masses from their lot, if only abstractly at first, by devising a complete technical solution to the systematic forces that impoverished millions of their health and dignity. As a student of science and international development, I put my sincere and unquestioning faith in economics, political science, public health, and medicine as the tools with which to grab hold of and finally fix the big machine. With enough study and willpower, I would one day harness the intellectual resources necessary to manipulate the levers of a complex world and achieve what no one had yet, the end of suffering. Okay, so as ambitious as that sounds, the second front involved eradicating suffering from my own life. And this is sort of another thing that kind of captures that. I said, I knew that the days would come when the repo man would take back what was his, piece by piece, until I was left with nothing. But I would not be caught off guard, blissfully ignorant of the harsh reality we all face. Though I might gradually be dispossessed of the goodness in my life just the same as everyone else, my parents, my health, my dignity, I would not be brought to my knees, floored by indignation and hostility towards what most would see as a betraying universe, a supposed friend turned loan shark. The piercing cries of why, God, why would erupt from the souls of those found unprepared, the poor amnesiacs who had foolishly taken their borrowed goods for granted as gifts from some kind benefactor. So while others would be left reeling outside of their foreclosed homes, frantically pulling furniture off the departing truck with last-minute pleas of desperation, I would stand by in the emptying halls of my life with silent indifference, neither pleased nor upset, just free from pain. Ever vigilant for the sound of an approaching truck, I would make the most of my possessions, cherishing them as best I could with whatever time I had left. So this what it really amounted to was somehow building a shield against these impending knockout blows of life, and sort of somehow defying life's physics and outsmarting fate. And the way I was going to do that was to somehow internalize the wisdom of the orphan, the diseased, and the defeated, that strange fearlessness and reevaluation of life's worth that seems to emerge amidst the grief of loss. But before I was inevitably stripped of my undervalued possessions. So my quest was to somehow reverse nostalgia, to not miss it once it was gone, but to actually have that vibrancy of desire and gratitude when it was here. Okay, and this applied to everything in my life. So that was the aim, was to essentially, I wanted to equip myself with this intellectual firepower and this spiritual armor, and then step out of this sort of abstract world of academia and extracurriculars and volunteer work and these gestures, and onto the battlefield of life to once and for all eradicate suffering. So the rest of my talk will be how that failed miserably. So this next chapter is called Discovering Futility. Okay, and I'm going to go through a few vignettes that sort of help break down my sort of confidence and my sort of epic battle against life, and then kind of see what happens beyond that. So this first vignette, what crushed this girl? So for 3 months after college in Peru, I was volunteering in a town called Pisco, which had been hit by an earthquake. And we were building houses, and I remember this one case in particular where this family had lost their 4-year-old girl. She had been crushed by a roof, and so we were rebuilding that home, and I was kind of thinking about this as we were physically rebuilding the roof of this house. And it dawned on me, having read Farmer and thought about this stuff a lot, just sort of the magnitude of the structural forces that were in play to crush this girl. So to think about it in a metaphorical sense, that it wasn't just a roof, it wasn't just concrete that crushed her. It was maybe, the fact that her family didn't have enough money to adequately reinforce their house, and maybe that was because the dad never had that great of an education or a job to be able to do that. Maybe that was because of a, sort of hampered economy that had never had a chance because of, political strife and sort of corruption that had happened for centuries because of, colonization and all, so zooming out from that, which seems ridiculous, but in a way it was putting into context this one gesture of helping this family and realizing, how am I ever going to do anything to counter these immense forces? It felt like I was bailing water out of a sinking ship. Okay, so this was sort of a dawning realization, and yet it didn't completely deter me. I just said, okay, this mountain is getting bigger and bigger, but that just means I need to work harder and faster and more frantically. So this next one, also in Peru, there was a man we were giving tuberculosis drugs to, and actually the one day that I met him, we were dropping groceries off. And I remember talking to some of his neighbors afterwards who approached us, and they said, "Why are you helping him? He's a bad man." And I learned about how this guy was an alcoholic, and he abused his wife, and he beat his kids. And he seemed like a nice enough guy when I met him. But this sort of, once again, started to kind of shake my understanding of who the good guys were, who the bad guys were, and what we were really doing here. Who were we fighting for? What was the point of all this? seemingly admirable humanitarian work. Another vignette from a few years before this in San Francisco, I was delivering sort of on a medical van that would go through San Francisco and sort of find pockets of homeless people and offer them basic services. There was a doctor on board, but I was the guy to give out Gatorade and toothbrushes and stuff. So, and to go find the people, I'd have to go out on the van and look for homeless people and be like, hey, the truck's here. And I remember seeing this one woman every week, and she lived under this bridge. And I didn't really talk to her more than just handing her some socks and just saying how she was doing or whatever. But I remember asking a guy I was working with this question. Well, no, I didn't ask him this question. This is the answer he gave me. But was that I said, what are we really doing here? Doesn't it seem discouraging when we see these same people here day in, day out, and they don't seem to be getting better? They're not moving on and getting into an apartment and getting a job. They're still homeless. And how do you sort of keep doing this when it doesn't seem to be working? Nothing seems to be changing. And he told me, he said, Phil, you need to be really careful because it's not always about fixing. And while I've sort of learned a lot about what that means since, and I'll talk a little bit about it, at the time it was just this discouraging thing. Well, if it's not about fixing, then what is it? Why? And not that it never is, but if it's not always about fixing, that was the only notion I had in my mind, then what could it be about? And what is the point? So sort of acknowledging the pain of leaving that woman under the bridge every week, and just leaving her there, not being able to pull her out of that, and seeing that she was making a choice, which maybe wasn't just her choice alone, and that there's a lot of other issues there, but just sort of acknowledging that it wasn't going to be, the way I envisioned her life to operate. And so this last vignette, we visited a woman in Peru who she was, I think, 23 years old. She had 2 kids. When we saw her, she was 67 pounds. She was emaciated from MDR-TB and from this treatment that had sort of ravaged her body. And we went there once again delivering groceries, I think, and also because she had said that she was going to stop treatment, but she wanted to die, and she was not going to continue treatment because it was too hard. And so we sat there. We sat there in 45 minutes in silence. And luckily that wasn't the end of the story. She did end up, saying, actually, I am going to choose to keep trying, to keep doing this. And but the real thing that happened to me there was sort of this question of when will I let this woman die if she wants to die? When is my sort of rigid notion of no, your life needs to look like this, or this can't happen, or this isn't acceptable. Sort of loosening my understanding of that. And in this context, that was the question, when will you let her die? But I realized there's sort of a broader way of looking at that question, which is, when will you let her die into the life she chooses, right? And that's the case with all sorts of people and situations in the world that deviate from your ideal of what they should look like, right? So essentially letting those experiences, letting those people that you care about, whatever, sort of die into the life that they choose. And that might be a death for you of sorts. I think that's what these are. They were sort of miniature death experiences in a way, but sort of with sort of a positive effect ultimately, and I'll sort of get to that. So this kind of left me really unsure about a lot of things. I realized I was losing on both fronts of this battle. So like I said, realizing the limits of my control on my outer world, the enormity of the forces that systematically impoverish people, sensing that flooding water in the boat, and becoming shackled by the shouldn't happen, those inconceivables. And so starting to accept, not willingly, but just, resigning to this very, depressing notion that maybe our efforts at most are always gestures, just meant more to appease our guilty conscience, to ease the bitter sting of undue privilege. The lines dividing good and bad, right and wrong, were breaking as black bled into white, as victims became perpetrators, as villains became humans, and the innocent became tarnished. I had used those lines as walls to push against, to secure my footing and direct my blows, but now I was shoveling smoke. The gray wasteland of an undivided world spurned apathy and disillusionment. The despair of seeing my idealism slowly deconstruct into utter relativism, almost nihilism. So there was that front. That was the external world that I realized the limits of my control in making the kind of change that I sort of demanded of myself. And then in the second front, realizing that I couldn't defend myself from these impending knockout blows, that all my search for spiritual wisdom and staying involved with this Catholic center and really just trying to sort of mine religion for what I thought would be a shield to protect me against pain, and give me, like I said, with some kind of reassurance, some kind of okay, even though it sucks and it's bad and it's hard, there's something redeeming about that, and that somehow numbs the pain. That's what I was looking for in spirituality and religion. So I was sort of, resigning once again to this sobering notion that I too would perpetually succumb to amnesia, fall asleep in Gethsemane, and I'll reference that. I guess I'll reference it here. And sort of this notion of Jesus in sort of the Garden of Gethsemane the night before his crucifixion, where he's telling his disciples to stay awake, and be vigilant, and they keep falling asleep. And this sense too that even Jesus himself praying to God, please God, not yet, spare me this suffering, I'm not ready to bear this cross. Those aren't his words. Or he says, my Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me. So just this notion of recognizing I don't want this suffering. I don't want this hardship of life. I don't want this hardship in the world. And please just get rid of it. Just somehow spare me of it. And that's sort of where I was at, and really recognizing my helplessness at that moment. So beyond that, recognizing my inability to control not just the outer world, but I realized too that I didn't have much control over my inner world, and sort of that doubt and that disillusionment about the world sort of made its way into myself. And I had sort of this intense self-doubt in my ability really to stay committed to anything, because of this disillusionment and dissatisfaction would forever sort of taint my commitments to people and jobs and places. I felt like this sort of extreme meaninglessness. I didn't know what the point was, really. And this sounds very extreme, and it was at the time, especially since objectively not a whole lot was happening in my life. This was the first few months of being in Boston, and I was working at this amazing organization, and I had my dream job, and things were great. I was looking at this promising career in medicine, but that's almost what reinforced that sort of those gnawing feelings of doubt, was that if this isn't good enough, if there's something here that's missing, if I'm still riddled with fear and anxiety, then what the hell will? Because this was all I ever wanted, was PIH, and was to do this great, amazing work and whatever. So that's really, in a weird way, kind of what heightened that. So it led me into this kind of period of really intense anxiety, and I was starting to have panic attacks last year, more than a year ago, almost 2 years ago. And so I sort of reached this breaking point, and that night of going to MGH, not knowing what anxiety was, I thought I was just going crazy. That was a real sort of breaking point, and this was the turning point, was to start to sort of go in the other direction and stop running from all this stuff I was fearing. So this is a quote: the thing that's really hard and really amazing is giving up on being perfect and beginning the work of becoming yourself. And I think the rest of that year, so October 2011 until August 2012, that's what this was. It was this uphill climb to really sorry, I'm just checking the time. To really start to kind of regain a confidence in myself and a trust. Like I said, I lost trust in life, being anything that, upon which I could reassure myself, and also in myself. I lost trust in myself of really trusting what I felt and thought and what I wanted to do. There was really no sort of ability to do that, and so the rest of sort of this year, those 8 months, was sort of recognizing this small, quiet intention to accept myself and accept those messy, broken parts of myself that I was really sort of distancing so much from, because once again it was this doubt and this like anger and disillusionment, and I was hating those parts of myself because they were causing all this disruption in my life. Everything was great objectively, and yet these like meddlesome sort of parts of my mind and my heart were getting in the way. And so it was this practice of starting to accept that these broken pieces of myself are sitting right here, I can't get rid of them, and these broken parts of the world are sitting right here. And I sort of was talking about those vignettes of you know, the acknowledging the pain of recognizing that it isn't always going to be, you know, sort of just removed of that brokenness and sort of that that fractured. So this is so I found a series of spiritual homes this year, this year in particular, in 2011, 2012, and the first one was Still Harbor, which this is Still Harbor, and I'm really glad Perry's here. She was one of the people that found me at this time, and I'll read this poem, which was my very first workshop there. I remember reading this, and it was just, once again, kind of this whispering of like remembering myself, and remember that I like belonged to something, and that I wasn't completely disconnected and fragmented and lost from the world, that actually maybe I was still connected to it somehow. And so this poem is called The Call. I've heard it all my life, a voice calling a name I recognized as my own. Sometimes it comes as a soft-bellied whisper. Sometimes it holds an edge of urgency. But always it says, wake up, my love. You are walking asleep. There's no safety in that. Remember what you are, and let this knowing take you home to the beloved with every breath. Hold tenderly who you are, and let a deeper knowing color the shape of your humanness. There's nowhere to go. What you are looking for is right here. Open the fist clenched and wanting, and see what you already hold in your hand. There is no waiting for something to happen, no point in the future to get to. All you have ever longed for is here in this moment, right now. You are wearing yourself out with all this searching. Come home and rest. How much longer can you live like this? Your hungry spirit is gone. Your heart stumbles. All this trying, give it up. Let yourself be one of the God-man, faithful only to the beauty you are. Let the lover pull you to your feet and hold you close, dancing even when fear urges you to sit this one out. Remember, there is one word you are here to say with your whole being. When it finds you, give your life to it. Spend yourself completely on the saying. Be one in this great love home we are writing together. And so that was, like I said, sort of something there was kind of reminding me, waking me up to sort of what I had forgotten about, sort of who I was and what I belonged to. So another center, the Paulist Center, which was sort of this Catholic home that I was kind of loosely connected to in this time, but once again it was this really saving grace in a lot of ways. And this is a poem that I found recently called Tolocho Lake. In this high place it is as simple as this. You leave everything you know behind. Step toward the cold surface, say the old prayer of rough love, and open both arms. Those who come with empty hands will stare into the lake astonished. There in the cold light, reflecting pure snow, the true shape of your own face. So this should maybe also like make you uncomfortable, like it did for me, because it was like, oh God, this idea of like giving up and giving in and just like giving yourself to something was terrifying. It was letting go of sort of the levers that I was trying to control in the world and in myself, right? And so it was not a comforting thing, but yet there was something kind of irresistible about it. So the last place was this meditation center in Cambridge, which was another amazing place for me to sort of find a group of people. And I found this class called Investigating the Nature of Self-Doubt. And I was sort of engrossed in reading about like sort of Buddhism and its take on sort of end-of-life care and palliative care and illness experience. And I was doing really just sort of digging in and really trying to look at more deeply how people get through incredibly difficult experiences. And at this point, it wasn't just about mining their experiences to somehow build this shield for myself. Like I said, what did I say? Like instilling the wisdom of the orphan, the disease, the defeated. Like I wanted that to protect myself. At this point, it was recognizing that I wanted to explore this stuff, but opening myself to the vulnerability. That I knew I couldn't fool myself into thinking I was safe from that. But still, there was this irresistible urge to look more deeply into these ideas of suffering and healing and illness, which our work is intimately connected to. So it was going from this sort of very practical, technical, mechanical understanding of things and wanting to kind of look deeper at sort of these more sort of existential, philosophical, and spiritual sort of aspects of these ideas. So, so basically, skipping through something. So this center also introduced me to this hospice class that I was taking last summer, and sort of getting to know suffering on a very personal, intimate level. It wasn't, about reading about it in books anymore. I mean, I had seen it in Peru, I'd seen it in Chile, in LA, where I was doing work as well, but really, looking someone in the face and hearing their stories. And the beautiful thing was that it wasn't like poor, starving children. It didn't need to be. It was like well-to-do, old white women in Cambridge, where it was like, whereas 2 years before, I would have had no reason to have any concern for these people. Suddenly, this was like the realest suffering that I had ever seen. And so listening to these people's stories about getting old and losing siblings and getting sick, and what that was like. It was like me in a room of like a bunch of 70-year-olds. And we were, talking about this stuff, and it was this amazing intimacy. And the question that I was left with at the end of this class, and this was right when I withdrew from medical school. I decided I didn't want to go. I was 2 weeks away from starting, and I said, I'm not going to go. I was in the middle of this class, and this was the question I asked in the last day of class. I said, how do we say yes to life when there is so much to say no to? And if you can tell, this is like really the question that sort of pervaded all of this. There's been this desire to be open to life, to not fight against it. I was always in this battle against it and against myself, and I wanted to not be at war with it. But how could you be at peace or say yes to or be open to life when there was all this horrible stuff that you didn't want to say yes to, that you didn't want to accept? And so, so this is the next chapter, the surrender. So me recognizing that I wanted authenticity, I wanted truth. I didn't want to delude myself into thinking that things were more safe and peachy than they actually were. I wanted reality, and yet I had no reassurance that things would work out if I sort of went that road, right? If I kind of pursued that. And so this was an excerpt from a letter I wrote to Arthur Kleinman, who was somebody I was reading a lot about with this sort of illness experience stuff, and I had met with him in May, just before I withdrew from med school and before the hospice class. But I wrote this to him. I said, this profound mistrust in my inner and outer worlds has left me with two equally unimaginable options: to either blind myself to the existential truth of how chaotic and unstable life really is, thereby, and to quote him, succumbing to comforting self-illusions and the merely mechanical requirements of social life, end quote, or to relinquish those illusions of assurance and control, and to no longer hide from the storm, but rather to give myself to it. And while the former seems undoubtedly safer and more secure, to bury my head in the sand and desperately clutch this patch of earth I might claim as my own, I already know that this path and a life of authenticity are mutually exclusive. And so I choose the latter, accepting that the storm will gradually dismantle my vessel until it one day sinks, that it will soon break my anchor free from the islands I love. It will push me back out to sea, shipwreck me on foreign lands, lose me and find me again and again. And here's another sort of poem I found recently. When words stop, you can hear the songs of the sea. In silence, lean on each other. We're together in the same boat. Let go of the oars. Trust this whole. The rudder knows answers and questions. Gently let all movements bring you closer to the divine current, the all-embracing sea. Waves break, the oyster melts with love. Look what happens when you let go. So this was the choice I made that summer with the hospice class, and with sort of just recognizing that I didn't want to hide myself and try to shield myself anymore. I wanted that truth and authenticity, and it was a huge leap of faith. There was no reassurance that that there would be something beyond that. And so I made that decision, and a few weeks later I was diagnosed with bone cancer. We found a tumor in my knee, and the remarkable thing about this is, for the first time in my life, I wasn't at war with life. That I was in a place, because of all these influences, and I don't attribute it to myself, it was very good, serendipitous, but almost beyond coincidence, that I was in a place to finally not go back to war with life, right? Which had every opportunity to do that, because suddenly it was like, why, all my questions about trusting life, how could I trust it when it lets us down, and when things happen that are so awful? It was now that I recognized this choice to actually choose to accept those broken parts of myself. And this was a very real example of that. I think cancer is a very real example of accepting those broken, fragmented parts of ourselves, right? Because in a way, it's like, these cells have gone rogue in my knee. They've betrayed me. And so that was the choice I recognized. And there was sort of a story that I kind of developed in the first few months of my treatment. And it was really something that kind of carried through, and still does. And it was kind of this amazing demonstration for me of what this really meant to sort of embody compassion in this way for my own experience and for my own body and for myself. And then, we'll see, hopefully I don't run out of time, but, moving that out into the world, and how, cultivating that in myself enabled me for the first time really to act that out in tangible ways of trying to build justice in the world. So I'll just read what I wrote, and sorry for all those readings, but it's probably better than me trying to just remember it. If you're not familiar with the parable of the prodigal son, that's okay, but you'll probably get the connection. A man had two knees. Once of age, the right knee went to his father and demanded his inheritance of blood. The father consented, and his son gathered together all he had before traveling to a distant land, where he fell among thieves and squandered his estate in foolish living. He indulged himself on more blood than was due to him, tainting the faultless bone around him with his addiction and greed. When he saw his poverty and came to his senses, he resolved to return to his father, to confess his sins and surrender his freedom. But when the prodigal knee was a long way off, the father saw him in all his disease and brokenness, and was filled with compassion. He ran to his son and threw his arms around him, kissing him. The son wept, saying, "Father, I've sinned against you and your body. I'm not worthy to be your knee." But the father told his limbs, "Bring out the best brace and rope him with it. Put a pillow underneath him and ice on his wound. Then bring the finest reserves of blood, and let us celebrate with a feast, because this knee of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and now is found." And while they were celebrating, the left knee was occupied with carrying his daily load. When he heard music and dancing, he called down to his cousin's foot and asked what these things meant. "Your brother has returned," the foot said, "and your father has brought forth the blood reserves, because he has him back safe and sound." Then the left knee became angry and threw off his load in protest. So his father came to him and heard his son. "I have served you for many years," cried the knee, "and never once have I disobeyed you. Yet you never gave me a trickle more of blood than was necessary. But now your son has returned to your service, and you reward him with our finest reserves. Do you not see what he has done? He has betrayed us all, devouring your gifts and poisoning your body with his excesses. Let us cut him off and cast him away from us, for the sake and safety of your faithful servant." Then the father took a great pause before saying, "My son, you have always been with me, and everything I have is yours. But worry not about your brother. I will heal him of his addiction and restore him to new life, even at the cost of all the riches of my body. And so we must rejoice, for your brother was dead and is alive again. He was lost and now is found." And so this for me was a really, just instrumental kind of example, because it came to define how I was going to relate to my body and this cancer, and really just my life, moving forward. And so this is to quote what I just said: "I will restore him to new life, even at the cost of all the riches of my body." And it was this notion that willing to accept that I for the sake of my life, I'm going to sacrifice a lot. I'm going to beat the hell out of my body, and out of reverence for my life, right? And also, like, that was kind of the love I had to show, and not the disdain for my knee, like, screw you, I have to do all this stuff now because you messed up, but saying, like, because I care so much about this knee, and because I care about so much about this body, I'm willing, at the cost of all the riches of my body, to die trying to save this knee. and the body more largely, of which it is a part, right? And it's not this separate thing, this problem that I had to fix, but really just it involved this reincorporation of the sort of broken fragments of myself. Okay. So this other kind of story, which was really sort of helpful for me and was starting to reveal sort of this understanding of what it means to actually sort of be loving and live that out, and not in some like superficial, nice, rosy kind of way, but in a really hard kind of way, what it sometimes means. So this is a story from John. He says, the author of John says, when they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said. "You know that I love you," Jesus said. "Feed my lambs." Again, Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Take care of my sheep." The third time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, "Do you love me?" He said, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my sheep. Very truly, I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go." Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Then he said to him, "Follow me." So I'll just sort of keep going, and then I'll get to the kind of next point. Well, this was the next point. The question being, what might love demand? And not in the sense of it's forcing you to do it. Because in a weird way, even though when I got diagnosed with cancer, I was forced in a lot of ways into that situation, but I wasn't forced in the way that I related to it. And I think that orientation is what love is. It's orienting towards life in a certain way, or it's consenting to it in a certain way. And once again, we'll maybe have time to talk about sort of the slippery nature of that, where it seems like this utter weakness and passivity and just like rolling over. And that's really not what it is. Actually, hopefully we'll get to that. That sort of paradox of how there is really power amidst that powerlessness. So this is the question, is what might love demand? And like I said before, I had made that decision where I wanted truth and I wanted love in my life. I wanted to be open to it, no matter how hard it would be. I didn't want to, like I said, to climb and bury my head in the sand and just keep myself comfortable. Or like I said earlier, with the repo man, just keep myself free from pain and like whatever, like not actually, whatever, open myself to or invest myself in this life. So recognizing that the sort of terrifying, which should be very unsettling, this idea of like what might love demand, like letting go of everything, of all these sort of rigid things that we might want to hold on to, with seemingly good intentions, and understandably so. And it's not saying, like this sort of masochistic, like, oh, you got to like get rid of, hate your father, hate your mother, and follow me, leave all your possessions. There's easy ways to misinterpret that, but I think it's just, once again, this openness, what Gutierrez talks about, the spiritual poverty of being open to life and open to God, where you're not grasping so tightly onto what it needs to look like and who you feel like you need to be, but actually maybe following, an authenticity and a truth and a love that isn't going to be comfortable, right? But can have some amazing, I think, rewards in sort of different ways. And once again, the obvious thing is, well, what if it doesn't work out? What if you die? Whatever. Even that, and we were talking about this idea of like dying into the life you choose, like, and especially, thinking from a justice, social, sort of side of it, it's easy to say, oh no, we're talking once again about this escapist mentality, like quitting the world for heaven and not focusing on the here and now. And once again, it's not that. It's not this sort of like one over the other. It's actually accepting, maybe in these small ways, getting old, letting life steer a little bit and dress you and lead you where it will, and yet that can be something that sort of gives fuel for like a life of love and authenticity. So, and real power too, to actually have real sort of healing effect, even in the midst of breakdown, when things, bodies and systems and economies break down and don't work out. So So this is like a quote from Khalil Gibran, author of The Prophet. He says, "When love beckons you to follow him, though his ways are hard and steep, and when his wings enfold you, yield to him. Though the sword hidden among his pinions may wound you, and when he speaks to you, believe in him. For even as love crowns you, so shall he crucify you. Even as he is for your growth, so he is for your pruning. Even as he ascends to your height and caresses your tenderest branches that quiver in the sun, so shall he descend to your roots and shake them in their clinging to the earth. And think not that you can direct the course of love, for if it finds you worthy, love directs your course." So we're running pretty short on time. So one sort of last vignette is this experience I had in the hospital this past year, which was sort of the recognition. I guess I won't go into the details of this, but just I was in my room and I was having like a horrible time. I had just been admitted and I was feeling awful, and there were all these things going wrong, like with my IV, and it was just like this irksome, like, when is this gonna? It almost seemed comical how, like, you know, things were unfolding because of how not according to plan they were going. And I remember being in my room and hearing this man through the wall who was coughing. And he wasn't just like coughing literally; it sounded like he was coughing to death. And I remember being like viscerally like uncomfortable. Obviously, you're in a hospital and you're hearing other people, and you don't ever see them. You don't know what's going on with them. You don't know if they died even. You're just kind of like in your room, and it's like, man, I feel utterly helpless, and I feel like crap. And I feel like really uncomfortable hearing this guy in the other room. And so what I did, what was so like profound for me about this experience, was I started to breathe, and almost sort of as a meditation, to try to breathe with this guy. And in this weird way, after a few minutes, I lost the sense of what side of the wall I was on. Like, I honestly, like, sort of had this experience where I had never, like, sort of, to use the literal definition of compassion, to suffer with someone. I had never had that experience of such intimacy when I didn't see this guy, and I don't know what happened to him. But to really recognize, and it was this moment of like realizing like how utterly vulnerable we are. Like me and this dude, who were like have no reassurances about how tonight is going to work out, how the rest of our lives are going to work out, and we seem utterly helpless and just like a cog in the machine, and things are happening to us beyond our control, and that's it. There's no powerlessness, or there's no power there, and yet at the same time feeling this incredible pride to be human. And also this power to say that I'm not a nameless cog in the machine, that actually we matter, even as we're getting beat down by just the mechanics of the universe. That we matter. There's something incredibly valuable at the heart of this. And so this is a quote: "There's a secret medicine given only to those who hurt so hard they can't hope." And what I'm talking about here is sort of crossing this threshold of despair, almost. And we kind of talked about that, but not being sure what was beyond that, and yet finding amidst that desolation some form of consolation. That even though it felt like the most isolating, alone night of my life, that I had never felt less alone in a very, very surreal way. And so I won't read through all this, but this is from the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, and he talks about, remain vulnerable. Accept your pain as a priceless gift and the chance of discovering what lies behind sorrow. Grief can be a garden of compassion. If you keep your heart open, your pain can become your greatest ally in your life search for love and wisdom. And this is from Rilke. Perhaps all the dragons in our lives are only princesses waiting for us to act just once with beauty and courage. Perhaps everything that frightens us is, in its deepest sense, something helpless that wants our love. So this gets back to that idea of accepting those fragmented, broken parts of myself, those things that I feared and hated, and actually showing them love, not just fighting against them, or with the prodigal son, where there was every reason in the world to throw him out and hate him and punish him, but to actually show him love. What a radical concept that is, right? And to recognize that there's something real that happens beyond that. So this is where sort of we kind of go from cultivating compassion for ourselves, for our own bodies, and for our experience, and then more broadly to other people's experiences into the world. Okay, and so this is a quote from Isaac Hecker: "Genuine contemplation and action are inseparable. Divine love is infinitely active, and when it has entered the human heart and has set it on fire, it pushes one to outward perfection and visible justice." So this is the bridge from love to justice. And even in that vignette of the parable of the prodigal need, it was there. The less need was this like die-hard justice to it. It's like, this guy messed up, he needs to get punished. I did good, I need to get rewarded. And then there's the right need, the prodigal need, which I learned recently, that word just means excess. It means like to live excessively is prodigal. It's not like a runaway or whatever. But there's him where sort of that fault lies. So the blame is that brother of justice who's sort of villainizing his mess up younger brother. And the fault lies with the brother who really feels that. And then there's the father who's able to hold all of that, to hold the fault and the blame that coexist in ourselves all the time, where we feel like we want to punish those parts of ourselves and the world that are messing up. And we don't want to, and we want to just reward and seek out, what's doing good, what's pleasurable, what's right. And there's something, this is what I'm getting at, is there's something bigger than all of that to hold both this and sort of infuse it with this justice, a sense of knowing what's right and wrong, and to acting justly, but also to loving unconditionally. Because everything in justice is conditional. You do things right, you get rewarded. You do things wrong, you get... But love, and that's what's so amazing about that, and it doesn't make any rational sense, is you don't deserve it. That prodigal son didn't deserve it, but he got it. My need didn't deserve love. But in doing that, that's somehow, in my mind, what it's all about, what we're sort of here to do, and sort of embodying that kind of compassion. And so this is a quote from a Buddhist monk who was jailed and tortured for 20 years. And when he got out, this is what he said: "My greatest fear was losing compassion for my captors." And it's this idea, this radical idea of which, it's like, that's exactly it. That's the most valuable thing that this guy had in jail, was to not lose love for the people who were torturing him, for the people who had betrayed him, right? For all these things in life that had let him down. That was the greatest challenge and the greatest reward, right? So, one other word about compassion there. So really, and I've sort of said this, is to kind of define that word once again, and this is what it means for me, is to suffer with, right? So how do you suffer with someone who's suffering, right? Because you're not sick like them, or you're not poor like them, or you're not whatever. So how do you do that? We talk about empathy and compassion, but I think what it is, what it has something to do with, is really suffering with the pain of being unable to rescue or save them that you feel. Once again, leaving that lady under the bridge. And that is the pain, that inability, recognizing that limited nature, or that pain of being unable to do anything for that, that parent or that person that you're losing. And there's some value in doing that, in being real and not trying to bury that or run away from it or dismiss it, but to really be present with that pain. That is what it is to suffer with yourself, and to suffer with your experience, and just the fact that it doesn't meet the ideal, that there's always that gap between the real and the ideal. To suffer with your experience and to suffer with another person. And so I think in embodying that and actually living out that compassion, that's what it means to be human. That's what it means to become more fully human. So I don't really have time for this. I was just going to say, I'll say like 2 words about this really cool distinction that this author and Dr. Rachel Naomi Remen makes between fixing, serving, and helping. I completely lost track of my pages. Actually, sorry, I'm going to skip that. And just one other point about what I was just saying. This is sort of the idea, this kind of connection between contemplation and action. Tara Brach says, some of the most revered social activists in the world base their work in radical acceptance. Gandhi in India, Aung San Suu Kyi in Burma, Nelson Mandela in Africa, all underwent the suffering of imprisonment and faced the powerlessness, loneliness, and discomfort of their oppression. With clear comprehension, they saw the potential suffering of angry reactivity and remained mindful of their intention to benefit others. By accepting rather than denying or reacting to their own suffering, they freed themselves to work without bitterness or self-pity for peace and justice. These and many others model the power of placing radical acceptance at the heart of the effort to alleviate suffering. Okay, so that's what I was talking about with suffering with yourself. Like that ability to do that, and maybe with that pain and indignation and disappointment and whatever, there's real fruits that are born from that. Instead of the obvious knee-jerk reaction of just like, I don't like this suffering, I want to get rid of it. Okay, and once again, very easy to slip down and say, oh, we're romanticizing poverty and sickness and illness, and I'm not doing that. I'm really not getting into like what this means in terms of like poverty alleviation in a material sense. I mean, that's a whole other conversation, but I'm kind of prefacing all of that, all of this like effort to make change in the world and to be good and to act out good in the world. It in my mind, and what I've come to learn is that it's prefaced by all of this, and that without it, it often does lead to apathy and burnout and disillusionment and cynicism, right? So that's sort of what we're talking about here, is this ability to transform suffering into compassion, which fuels a life of living out love and acting justice. So, all right. Yeah, just one last quote. I really like this. If you have come to help me, then you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your destiny is bound up with mine, then let us work together. This was an Australian Aboriginal woman. And I really like this because it sort of breaks down this notion of what it means to help, people. And often, just the one sort of quick thing that I was going to say is it's those three things. Fixing sees life as broken. Helping sees life as weak. Serving sees life as whole. Okay? And those are sort of three different ways or areas from which you can operate in relating to someone. And I think, not to say there's never a time for fixing or for helping, but just to value that there is something beyond seeing things or people or systems as broken things that need to be fixed. Or I am this powerful, well-to-do person who can help you, wealthy person. But there's another dimension to that there, where you actually are equal, with each other, and there's a real power and a real healing, I think, that can take place once again beyond the breakdown of the mechanics. That was just one last thing. So this is how I wanted to end. Is the second, and this is my interpretation. The second or last question of theology is, how do we believe the poor, the sick, and the suffering when they say God loves us? Because my biggest question was, how do I tell the poor God loves you, and explain that in some rational way and whatever? And I had no answer to that. And yet, I found, in my experience and other people's experiences, that they're often the ones telling me this. That those who are most suffering, who have faced this stuff most directly, are the ones needing to tell me. And the real challenge is, how do I believe them? Because I have to think they're not crazy. There is some truth in what they speak. And so just my very last slide. This was a few weeks ago when I was getting my scan, a 6-month scan, which was clear, which is great. And this was my prayer going into the machine. It wasn't praying to a God in a petitional way of, take this cup from me, spare me from suffering, just get rid of this cancer, and then I don't need anything to do with you. Just fix my life, pretty it up, and then that's good enough. It wasn't about a God who does. Okay, and it's not to say he can't do, because there was something I didn't quote in here, but when Jesus is getting led to the crucifixion, he says, don't you know that I could call on my Father and have 12 legions of angels here right now, as these guys are deriding him and beating him and being like, oh yeah, King of Kings, what are you doing? Your God would save you right now if he could, right? And that gets into a whole other thing of well, why didn't he? And whatever, and was that necessary? Was it, but just this idea of before I saw a God who either didn't do or couldn't do. He was handcuffed or he didn't care. And then transforming this idea into what really is most awe-inspiring for me is not a God who does, but a God who simply is. That consolation amidst desolation. And I think there is real action and real effects in the world that can come from that. So this is my prayer, not do for me, but be with me, regardless of, if it doesn't work out. So that is my presentation. Sorry that I took up all the time.